I was 46 years old when I realized my marriage had a schedule I wasn't invited to. My name is Kalichi Morgan. Everyone calls me Kel. And I thought I knew my wife. 15 years of watching someone leave your house at the exact same time, every single week, and you start to think it's normal. You start to tell yourself it's nothing. Just errands. Just life. Just the rhythm of a long marriage. But Christmas Eve fell on a Friday that year. And when my wife, Ifunanya, dressed like she was going somewhere sacred, kissed me on the cheek with trembling lips, and whispered, "I'll be right back," like a prayer she didn't believe in anymore, I knew something was wrong. So I did the one thing a husband isn't supposed to do when he still wants his world to make sense. I followed her. And what I found that night didn't just break my heart. It shattered everything I thought I understood about the woman I'd loved for 2 decades. Let me go back to the beginning. It started so small, I almost didn't notice. Every Friday, at exactly 4:17 p.m., Yef would glance at the kitchen clock, grab her purse, and head for the door. Not 4:15, not 4:20, exactly 4:17. Like her body had an alarm built into it. She'd say the same thing every time. "I'll be right back, baby." And she always was. 1 hour and 40 minutes later, 6:57 p.m., give or take 2 minutes, she'd walk back through that door looking calm, composed, like she'd just been to the grocery store or the post office. We lived in a quiet suburb outside Houston, in a neighborhood called Meadowbrook Estates. Tree-lined streets, brick houses with front porches, Christmas lights starting to go up in early December. The kind of place where people still waved at each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Ife worked as a bookkeeper for a medical office downtown. I managed operations for a mid-sized logistics company. We had 2 kids. Our daughter Amara was 23 and living in Austin, working at a tech startup, and our son Chidi was 17 and obsessed with basketball, already getting recruitment letters from colleges. Normal life. Good life. The kind of life you see in commercials around the holidays. Except for those Fridays. At first, I didn't think twice about it. If said she had a standing appointment with a women's Bible study group at a church across town. Mount Zion Baptist, she'd said. Then a few months later, it was errands for her mother who lived in 3rd Ward. Then it was meeting a girlfriend named Sheila who was going through a divorce and needed someone to talk to every week. The excuse would rotate like seasons, but the time never changed. 4:17 p.m. every single Friday. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter cold. 15 years. You might think I'm slow for not catching on sooner. Maybe I was. But when you love someone, you give them the benefit of the doubt. You trust them. And Ife had never given me a reason not to. She was steady, reliable. The kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who made extra food for church potlucks, who called her mother every Sunday without fail. Until I started noticing the small things. She kept receipts, but she never left them out. I'd see her fold them into tiny squares and tuck them into the bottom of her purse, buried under lipstick tubes and loose change. When I asked casually what she'd bought, she'd give vague answers. "Oh, just some things for the house. A gift for someone at work." Never specific, never detailed. She was strict about money in a way that didn't match our income. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Solid middle class, 2 steady paychecks, modest savings. Still, Ife would panic if I suggested a weekend trip or a nice dinner out. She'd say we needed to save. She'd get this look in her eyes, this flash of fear, sharp and wild, and change the subject. She clipped coupons religiously. She bought generic brands. She turned off lights in empty rooms like we were 1 bill away from disaster. And sometimes, maybe twice a month, she'd come home from those Friday trips with red, swollen eyes. She'd blame it on allergies, or the cold wind, or dust from construction on the highway. But Houston in December isn't that cold. And her eyes looked like she'd been crying in a parked car for 20 minutes, mascara smudged at the corners, her breathing still uneven. I told myself I was paranoid. That marriage meant giving each other space. That after 20 years together, some routines were just routines. People need their own time, their own corners of privacy. I had my Thursday night poker games with the guys from work. She had her Friday afternoon thing. It was normal, it was fine. But then Christmas Eve arrived, and it fell on a Friday. If you're watching this and you've ever had that gut feeling that something's wrong, that instinct you can't explain, that voice in your head that won't shut up, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from, because what happened next is something I'll never forget. Christmas Eve morning felt heavy. The air itself seemed weighted down with something I couldn't name. It was quieter than usual as she made breakfast, pancakes, turkey sausage, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filling the kitchen. The radio played gospel Christmas songs. Outside, the neighborhood glittered with decorations, inflatable snowmen, candy cane pathway lights, that one house down the street that went all out with synchronized music. Chidi was still asleep upstairs, probably dreaming about the new gaming console we'd wrapped and hidden in the garage. The house smelled like pine from the tree we'd decorated 2 weeks earlier, ornaments we'd collected over the years hanging from every branch. Mariah Carey's Christmas album played softly from the living room speaker. Ife kept glancing at the clock above the stove. I tried to ignore it. I wrapped a few last-minute gifts at the dining room table. A scarf for Ife's mother, a book for my brother. I texted Amara to confirm she'd be home by dinner. She was driving in from Austin and complained about traffic already backing up on I-10. I pretended everything was fine, but at 3:45 p.m., Ife went upstairs to change. I heard the bedroom door close, heard the closet open, heard drawers sliding. When she came back down 30 minutes later, my chest tightened, like someone had wrapped a band around my ribs. She wasn't dressed for errands. She wore a charcoal gray dress, her good coat, the wool one with the black buttons she only wore to funerals and job interviews. Her hair was freshly flat-ironed, falling straight past her shoulders. She'd put on makeup. Not everyday makeup, full makeup, lipstick, earrings. She carried a thick manila envelope in her hand, something bulky inside, the edges bent from whatever she'd stuffed in there, and her fingers were white-knuckled around it like she was afraid it might escape. "Baby, I have to run out for a bit," she said, her voice too steady, too rehearsed. "On Christmas Eve?" I asked, standing up from the couch. "Ife, it's Christmas Eve. Everything's closed." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The smile stopped at her cheekbones. "I know. It's just, I promised someone I'd drop something off. It won't take long. I'll be right back. Promise." She kissed me on the cheek, and her lips were trembling. I felt them shake against my skin. I watched her walk to her car, a silver Honda Accord, 8 years old, a dent in the back bumper from when Chidi backed into a mailbox learning to drive. She pulled out of the driveway slowly, carefully, like she was driving towards something that required courage. The taillights disappeared down the street, past houses strung with blinking lights, and inflatable Santas and nativity scenes glowing in front yards. And something inside me snapped. I grabbed my keys, pulled on my jacket, and followed her. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept 2 cars between us, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my ears, behind my eyes. The heater blasted hot air, but my skin felt cold. My breath fogged the windshield every time I exhaled, and I had to keep wiping it clear with my sleeve. I felt like a criminal. Like I was betraying her, like I was the one doing something wrong, but I also felt like I was finally doing what I should have done years ago, what some part of me had been screaming at me to do every Friday for the past decade and a half. I didn't head toward the shopping district. She didn't turn toward her mother's neighborhood in Third Ward, or the church she'd mentioned, or any of the places she'd claimed to go over the years. She took the highway south, merging into light Christmas Eve traffic, then exited into an older commercial area near the city's edge, a part of town I'd only driven through a few times. The kind of area that looked like it had been thriving in the 80s and slowly declined ever since. She pulled into a strip mall parking lot. Half the businesses were closed, windows papered over or covered with dusty blinds. A check-cashing place with bars on the windows, a pawn shop with a flickering neon sign, a vape store, and at the end of the row, a legal office with tinted windows and a sign that read Creed and Associates Financial Services in gold lettering that had started to peel at the edges. If parked near the entrance, under a streetlight that had just started to flicker on in the dying afternoon light. She sat in her car for a full minute, maybe longer, staring at the envelope in her lap. I watched her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths, like she was preparing herself for something. Then she checked her face in the rearview mirror, wiped under her eyes with her thumb, and opened the door. The cold December air bit at my face when I cracked the window. I could see the glow of Christmas lights from a gas station across the street. Hear the faint sound of Silent Night playing from someone's car radio. A few shoppers hurried in and out of a dollar store at the other end of the strip mall, carrying bags. And I waited. 10 minutes crawled by like an hour. My phone buzzed with a text from Chidi asking when dinner would be ready. I didn't answer. Then the door opened. He stepped out, but she wasn't alone. A man followed her. White, late 50s, maybe early 60s, in a tailored three-piece suit that looked expensive and out of place in this rundown strip mall. Slicked back gray hair, sharp features, the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled without calculation behind it. He wasn't warm, he wasn't friendly. He looked at Ife the way a landlord looks at a tenant who's 3 months late on rent. Cold, expectant, vaguely irritated. She handed him the envelope. He opened it right there in the parking lot, standing under the streetlight, completely unbothered by the cold. He flipped through what looked like a thick stack of cash. I could see the green even from where I was parked. Counted it methodically with his thumb and nodded once. No thank you. No handshake. No warmth. Just a cold, business-like nod that said, "This is what you owe me, and this is what I expect." Then he said something I couldn't hear from this distance, leaning in slightly, and Ife's shoulders sagged like someone had cut the strings, holding her upright. She nodded quickly, desperately. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to be discreet, trying to maintain some dignity. The man turned and walked back inside without another glance. The door closed behind him with a heavy thunk I could almost feel from where I sat. I've stood there for a moment, alone in the parking lot, her breath misting in the cold air. Then she got into her car, sat there for another minute with her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, and finally drove away. I sat there frozen, my mind racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. That wasn't an affair. It wasn't a romance. It was something worse. It was a transaction, and my wife looked like she'd just paid a debt to the devil himself. I got home 10 minutes before she did, speeding through yellow lights, my heart still hammering. I was sitting on the couch when she walked in, her face carefully neutral, her coat still buttoned up to her throat. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice bright and false. "Traffic was awful. You hungry? I'll start on dinner." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth. I wanted to shake her until she told me everything, who that man was, what that envelope contained, why she'd been lying to me for 15 years. But instead, I just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, let me help with dinner." We moved through the kitchen like robots going through programmed motions. She made her jollof rice and fried plantains, the spices filling the air. Onions, tomatoes, curry, thyme. I set the table, laying out plates and forks with mechanical precision. Chidi came downstairs and talked about some video game tournament he'd watched online, his voice excited and oblivious. Christmas music still played in the background, Joy to the World sounding hollow and mocking. And the whole time, I watched Ife's hands shake as she stirred the pot. After dinner, after Chidi went to his room to play video games with his headphones on, after we'd cleaned the kitchen in tense silence, I waited until Ife was in the shower. I heard the water turn on, heard her close the bathroom door. Then I did something I'd never done before in 20 years of marriage. I searched. I started with her purse, dumping the contents onto the bed. Old receipts from gas stations and grocery stores, gum wrappers, a grocery list, a church bulletin from 3 months ago, loose change. Nothing. I checked her car, using the spare key from the hook by the garage door. I opened the glove compartment, checked under the seats, looked in the trunk. Same thing, just normal car debris. An ice scraper, jumper cables, a blanket, some old fast food napkins. But then I remembered something. Years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years back, Ife had bought a small lockbox at an office supply store. She'd said it was for important documents, birth certificates, social security cards, the deed to the house. She kept it in the back of our bedroom closet, pushed behind boxes of old photos and Christmas decorations we only used some years. I found the key taped under a jewelry box in her dresser drawer, hidden beneath a tangle of necklaces she never wore. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the box. Inside, I found a folder, a thick manila folder, edges worn and soft from years of handling. And inside that folder, I found the truth. The documents were old, some nearly 20 years old. Faded paper, the ink starting to yellow at the edges. Signatures I didn't recognize written in shaky handwriting. Legal terms I barely understood at first glance. Debt settlement agreement, estate obligations, payment schedule, beneficiary guarantee. My hands shook as I read, squinting at the small print, trying to make sense of the legal language that seemed designed to confuse anyone who tried to understand it. If's father had died when she was 28, 5 years before we got married. His name was Ikenna. I'd never met him, only seen photos. He'd been a proud man, Ife always said. A mechanic with rough hands and big dreams. He'd worked at other people's shops for 20 years, saving every penny he could, until finally, in 1997, he tried to start his own auto repair shop on the south side of Houston. He'd taken out a loan to do it, partnered with a man named Malcolm Creed, who'd presented himself as an investor, a businessman who believed in supporting black entrepreneurs. The loan was $48,000, everything Ikenna needed for tools, equipment, the first year's rent on the building. The shop failed within 2 years. The neighborhood was wrong. The competition was too fierce. Ikenna's health started failing. Diabetes he'd ignored for too long, then a stroke that left him weaker. The business collapsed under the weight of all of it. But the debt didn't. I read through the loan agreement, my legal knowledge barely adequate to understand what I was seeing. Creed had structured the loan with terms that seemed deliberately designed to trap someone. Compound interest that calculated monthly instead of yearly. Administrative fees for every payment processed. Penalty clauses for late payments. And the definition of late was any payment received after 5 p.m. on the due date. And buried in the fine print, a clause that said, if the borrower died before the loan was repaid, the obligation transferred to the estate, and to any living family members who'd benefit from the estate. When Ikenna died in 2000, he left almost nothing. A house in 3rd Ward that was barely standing, worth maybe $30,000, an old pickup truck, some tools, and a $48,000 debt that had already grown to $67,000 with interest and fees. Creed had gone after the estate immediately, like a predator who'd been waiting. He'd shown up at Ife's mother's house with lawyers and paperwork. He'd threatened to seize the house, to sue, to destroy her mother's credit and force her into homelessness. Ife's mother was 60 years old, working as a home health aide, barely making enough to survive. So Ife made a deal. She'd pay, every week, in cash, $2,000 per payment, until the debt was gone. But the debt never went away. Every payment she made was eaten up by new fees, new interest calculations, new administrative costs. The balance would go down by a few $100s, then jump back up by 1,000. It was a hamster wheel designed to never stop turning. I found payment logs going back 15 years. If had documented everything, dates, amounts, receipt numbers. She'd been paying $2,000 every single Friday at 4:17 p.m. for 15 years. I did the math on a piece of scrap paper, my hands shaking so badly the numbers barely came out legible. 52 weeks a year, 15 years, $2,000 per payment. She'd paid $560,000. No. Wait. I'd calculated wrong in my panic. Let me recalculate. $2,000 times 52 weeks is $104,000 per year, times 15 years, if had paid over $1.5 million. No. That couldn't be right either. My mind was racing, panicking. I counted the payment logs more carefully. Some weeks she'd missed because of holidays or when Creed's office was closed. Some payments were less, $500, one $800. But conservatively averaging it out, she'd paid at least $127,000 over 15 years for a $48,000 loan. And according to the most recent statement in the folder, dated just 2 weeks ago, the remaining balance was still $34,000. She'd paid nearly 3 times the original amount, and she still owed more than half of it. And she'd done it all in silence, alone, without telling me, without asking for help, because she thought she was protecting us. The shower turned off. I heard the bathroom door open, heard Ife's footsteps in the hallway. I was sitting on the edge of the bed with the folder open in my lap when she walked into the bedroom wearing her robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She froze in the doorway when she saw what I was holding. The color drained from her face. "Kel, every Friday at 4:17, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "For 15 years. Her hands flew to her mouth. "I can explain. You've been paying this man over $100,000, I said, my voice shaking now, anger and heartbreak fighting for control. "And you didn't tell me. Not once. Not one single time in 15 years did you tell me." She sank onto the bed beside me, her hands covering her face, her shoulders starting to shake. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to think I came from a broken family. I didn't want you to think I was damaged goods, that I was bringing debt and shame into our marriage. I didn't want you to leave." "Leave?" I stared at her, my vision blurring. "Ife, I would have helped you. We could have fought this together. We could have hired a lawyer, refinanced in something. You didn't have to carry this alone." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto the folder in my lap. "You don't understand. He threatened my mother. He said, if I missed a single payment, he'd take her house. He said he'd sue me personally, that he'd come after our assets, that he'd ruin us. He said he had the law on his side, that everything was legal and binding. I couldn't risk it, Kel. I couldn't risk losing everything. My mother's home, our house, our kids' future. I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just kept paying, eventually it would be over. "Who is this man?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Malcolm Creed. He owns that financial services company. He preys on people like my father. People who don't understand contracts, who are desperate, who just want a chance." She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen and desperate. "He's been doing this for decades, Kel. I've seen other people in that office over the years, other families trapped just like me. He's a predator." And I was too scared to fight back. I was too ashamed to ask for help. If you're still watching, if this story is hitting you in the chest because you've ever carried a burden alone to protect someone you love, because you've ever been too ashamed to ask for help when you needed it most, pause right now and comment the word warrior. Because what happened next is when we stopped being victims and started fighting back. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Ife cried softly beside me, her body curled away from mine. Christmas morning came and went in a blur. Amara arrived home around noon, tired from the drive, complaining about the traffic on I-10, but smiling when she saw the tree, the presents, the feast. Ife had somehow managed to prepare despite everything. We opened gifts. We ate leftovers from the Christmas Eve dinner. We watched The Grinch with Chidi, who kept checking his phone between scenes. We smiled. We laughed at the right moments. We pretended. But the whole time, my mind was working, planning, calculating. Monday morning, I called in sick to work. Then I made another call. I contacted a lawyer named Patricia Okonkwo, a Nigerian woman in her 50s who specialized in predatory lending and consumer fraud. I'd found her through a coworker named Marcus, whose cousin had been scammed by a payday loan company a few years back. Patricia had helped them sue the company into bankruptcy. I called her office at 8 a.m. sharp. Her receptionist tried to schedule an appointment for the following week, but I told her it was urgent. 20 minutes later, Patricia herself called me back. She had a voice like cut glass, sharp, precise, no nonsense. I told her everything: the 15-year payment schedule, the original loan amount, the total paid, the threats, the compound interest, the endless fees. I sent her photos of every document from Ife's lockbox, the original loan agreement, the payment logs, the recent statements, everything. She was silent for a long moment after I finished talking. Then she said, "Mr. Morgan, stay by your phone. Give me 72 hours. 3 days later, Patricia called me back. "Mr. Morgan," she said, and I could hear the controlled fury in her voice. "Your wife has been the victim of illegal loan sharking. This man, Malcolm Creed, has been operating outside the bounds of Texas finance law for at least a decade, probably longer. The interest rates he's charging exceed the state's usury limits by a factor of 4. The fees he's imposing are not enumerated in the original contract, which makes them fraudulent. And the threats he made to your wife, threats of property seizure, personal lawsuits, intimidation, constitute criminal extortion under Texas Penal Code Section 3103. My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. "Can we stop him?" "We can bury him," Patricia said with cold certainty. "But I need your wife to be willing to fight. This won't be easy. He'll retaliate. He'll threaten. He'll try to scare her into backing down. Can she handle that?" I looked across the kitchen at Ife, who was watching me with terrified eyes. I held her gaze. "Yes, we can handle it." Patricia worked fast. Within a week, she'd contacted the Texas Department of Banking and filed a formal complaint. She reached out to the Texas Attorney General's Office, Consumer Protection Division. She started digging through public records and found something that made her actually laugh on the phone. A dark, satisfied laugh. "Mr. Morgan, this man doesn't even have a proper lending license. He's been operating under the guise of financial consulting services to avoid regulation. That means every single loan he's made for the past 20 years is potentially void under state law. She found 4 other victims of Malcolm Creed, people who'd been trapped in the same cycle. A man who'd borrowed $30,000 for medical bills and paid $89,000 over 9 years. A woman who'd borrowed $15,000 for her daughter's wedding and was still paying 7 years later. A family who'd borrowed $55,000 to start a restaurant and lost everything, including the restaurant itself. Patricia built a case like she was constructing a fortress, brick by brick, document by document, victim by victim. But Malcolm Creed didn't sit quietly. 2 weeks after we started the legal process, someone tried to break into our house. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m. Ife and I were asleep when we heard the sound of splintering wood from the back door. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet and ran downstairs, my heart in my throat. By the time I got there, whoever it was had fled. They didn't take anything. They just left the back door jimmied open, the frame cracked, a clear warning. The police came, took a report, dusted for prints. They found nothing useful. Then 3 days later, Ife got a phone call. No caller ID, no number. She answered it on speakerphone while we were eating dinner. Chidi had already gone upstairs, a man's voice calm and cold. "Mrs. Morgan, you're making a mistake. Whatever your husband thinks he's doing, he needs to stop. Drop it now, or I'll make sure he loses everything. His job, his house, his reputation. Do you understand me?" Ife's hand shook so badly, she nearly dropped the phone. I grabbed it from her and shouted, "Who the hell is this?" The line went dead. We reported it to Patricia immediately. She recorded the incident, added it to the case file, and said 3 words that changed everything. That's felony intimidation. But I knew we couldn't wait for the legal system to move at its glacial pace. Creed was escalating, and I had a terrible feeling he wasn't done. That's when Patricia and I set a trap. If agreed to one more Friday payment. She hated the idea. I could see the fear in her eyes when we discussed it, but she understood why it was necessary. Patricia provided a small recording device, the kind detectives use, that clipped to the inside of Ife's coat pocket. The audio quality was excellent. It would capture everything. The plan was simple. Ife would go to Creed's office at the usual time, 4:17 p.m., with the usual cash payment of $2,000. But this time she'd ask questions. She'd get him to confirm the terms, to reference the threats he'd made, to talk about the administrative fees that kept the balance from ever decreasing, to say, in his own words, exactly what he'd been doing for the past 15 years. Patricia called it letting him hang himself with his own rope. On Friday, January 17th, I drove Ife to the strip mall parking lot. Patricia was already there, parked in an unmarked sedan with an investigator from the Attorney General's office, a man named James Chen, who looked like he'd been waiting his whole career to take down someone like Malcolm Creed. At exactly 4:15 p.m., Ife turned to me in the passenger seat. "What if he knows? What if he checks me for a wire or something?" "He won't," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "He's too arrogant. He thinks you're too scared to ever fight back." She took a deep breath, checked her reflection in the visor mirror, and nodded. "Okay, I can do this." "You're the strongest person I know," I told her, and I meant it. At 4:17 p.m., she got out of the car and walked across the parking lot toward Creed & Associates Financial Services. I waited in Patricia's car with her and James Chen, watching the door. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought they could probably hear it. Ife was inside for 12 minutes. They felt like the longest 12 minutes of my life. I watched the second hand on my watch crawl around the dial. I counted my breaths. I prayed, something I hadn't done in years, that this would work. When Ife finally came out, her face was pale but determined. She walked back to Patricia's car with steady steps, even though I could see her hands shaking. She got into the back seat and nodded once. Patricia smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "We got him!" "We got him," Ife whispered. The recording was damning. That night, in Patricia's office, the four of us sat around a conference table and listened to the entire conversation. Malcolm Creed's voice came through crystal clear. "You're 2 days behind schedule, Mrs. Morgan. You know how I feel about tardiness." "I'm sorry, Mr. Creed. Christmas was expensive this year, and I don't care about your excuses. The agreement is clear. Every Friday, 4:17 p.m., $2,000. That's what keeps your mother's property safe. That's what keeps me from filing liens against your assets. I know, I'm here now. I have the full amount. Plus the late fee. That's an additional $350. What? That's not. It's in the Administrative Oversight Clause, Mrs. Morgan. Any payment received after 4:17 p.m. on Friday incurs a $350 penalty. You arrived at 4:19. That's insane. I was 2 minutes late because of traffic. Then you should have left earlier. Now, are you going to pay the full amount, or do I need to make some calls? Because I have your husband's employer's phone number right here in my files." Patricia paused the recording. "That's extortion. Clear as day." There was more. Much more. Creed talked about the administration fees that had been added over the years, none of which appeared in the original contract. He referenced other clients who'd learned their lesson about trying to fight him. He laughed when Ife asked when the debt would finally be paid off. "When I say it is, Mrs. Morgan, that's how this works. Your father signed a binding agreement, and you inherited that obligation when he died. It'll be paid off when I decide it's been paid off." James Chen, the AG investigator, actually smiled when the recording ended. "I've been investigating this guy for 3 years. We've never been able to get a victim to wear a wire before. They were all too scared. This recording is enough for multiple felony charges: extortion, fraud, operating without a license, usury. We can move on this tomorrow." 2 days later, a Sunday morning, the Texas Attorney General's office raided Creed and Associates Financial Services. Patricia called me at 8 a.m. to tell me it was happening. "They're executing the warrant right now," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Ife and I drove to the strip mall, parking across the street where we could watch. 4 AG vehicles were parked outside the office. Investigators in windbreakers were carrying boxes of documents to their vans. Malcolm Creed stood outside in handcuffs, his tailored suit looking ridiculous next to the casual clothes of the law enforcement officers surrounding him. He looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating. Just a man who'd built his fortune by exploiting desperate people, and now his empire was being packed into cardboard boxes. Ive grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard it hurt. But she was smiling. Actually smiling. Over the next week, the story exploded. Patricia had contacted a reporter at the Houston Chronicle who'd been investigating predatory lending practices. The story ran on the front page. Financial services company accused of multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Other victims came forward, dozens of them. People who'd been too ashamed or too scared to speak up before. The Attorney General's office announced they were investigating over 40 cases linked to Malcolm Creed. His assets were frozen. His business was shut down. And 3 months later, in a courtroom packed with victims and their families, Malcolm Creed pled guilty to multiple felonies: extortion, fraud, operating without a license, usury violations. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. And as part of the settlement agreement, every victim was refunded all payments made beyond the legal limits. If got a check for $114,000, everything she'd paid beyond what would have been legal interest on the original loan. We didn't celebrate right away. The relief was too heavy, too raw, too complicated. I've cried for 2 days straight, not sad tears exactly, but the kind of crying that comes when you finally let go of something you've been holding for too long. She cried in the shower. She cried while cooking dinner. She cried while watching TV. She cried like she was releasing 15 years of fear and shame and exhaustion all at once. We went to therapy, both of us, individual sessions and couples sessions. We had to rebuild trust, not because she cheated or betrayed me in the traditional sense, but because she'd carried this enormous burden alone for 15 years, because she thought she had to protect me by lying to me, because she hadn't believed our marriage was strong enough to handle the truth, and I had to examine why she'd felt that way. What signals I'd sent that made her think I couldn't handle her problems. What kind of husband I'd been that made her choose silence over partnership. It was painful work, the kind of therapy where you leave the session feeling worse before you start feeling better. But slowly, gradually, we healed. Our marriage didn't break. It deepened. We learned to talk about money, really talk about it, without shame or fear. We learned to ask each other the hard questions. We learned that love isn't just about being there for the good moments. It's about being strong enough to carry the hard ones together. It's about building trust deep enough that you never have to carry something alone. Avia started sleeping better. The dark circles under her eyes faded. She stopped flinching when Friday came around. She laughed again. The real kind, the kind that used to fill our house before the weight of silence crushed her. The kind of laughter that makes your whole body shake. She started volunteering with a nonprofit called Debt Justice Coalition that helps families escape predatory lending situations. She uses her experience, her story, to help other people. She's testified before the state legislature twice now, pushing for stronger consumer protection laws. And me? I learned that partnership isn't just about being in love. It's about being a safe place, about creating a marriage where your partner knows, really knows, that they can tell you anything, that there's no burden too heavy to share, that you're in it together, no matter what. It's been 2 years since that Christmas Eve. 2 years since I followed my wife to a strip mall parking lot and discovered a secret that had been eating her alive for 15 years. If still works as a bookkeeper, but now she also does pro bono work for the Debt Justice Coalition, helping families review contracts and understand predatory terms before they sign. I'm still in logistics, but I make damn sure I'm the kind of person my family can come to with their problems. Our kids know the story now, Amara cried when Ife finally told her. Chidi got angry, the righteous kind of anger, and wanted to know why we hadn't told him sooner. We explained that some things are too heavy for children to carry, even when they're not children anymore. But the best part? Every Friday at 4:17 p.m., we sit on the couch together and watch the clock tick by. We don't go anywhere. We just hold hands and breathe and remember. Sometimes Ife still gets emotional. Sometimes she'll squeeze my hand and whisper, "I can't believe it's over." And I'll squeeze back and say, "It's over. You're free." Because Fridays don't own us anymore. That time belongs to us now. Sometimes we use it to go for a walk. Sometimes we just sit in comfortable silence. Sometimes we talk about the past, about what we learned, about how we're different now. But mostly, we just exist together in that moment, 4:17 p.m. on a Friday. And we're grateful. If you made it to the end of this story, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below. What would you have done if you found out your partner was hiding something this big? Would you have followed them? Confronted them immediately? waited, and gathered evidence, would you have been able to forgive? Because the truth is, love isn't about never keeping secrets. It's about building a partnership strong enough that you never have to. It's about creating a space where the truth, no matter how ugly or shameful or frightening, is always safer than silence. And that's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.